I stayed completely still on the day they thought I lost everything. No tears. No argument. No desperation. Just a calm, unreadable expression, while my father handed an $18 million empire to my brother like it had always belonged to him. Everyone in that room believed they were watching the end of my story. They had no idea, it was the moment I had been preparing for 3 years. Because what no one knew was that I had already won. And by the time they realized it, it would be too late to stop what was coming. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or erased, subscribe now, and comment where you're watching from, because this story? It's going to stay with you. My name is Victoria Hale, and for 10 years, I built an empire that never carried my name. At 29, I managed every moving piece of my family's real estate portfolio, contracts, permits, renovations, crises. When pipes burst at 3 a.m., I was the call. When investors panicked, I stabilized them. When numbers didn't add up, I fixed them before anyone noticed. My father stood in tailored suits, shaking hands, taking credit. My brother posed beside him, smiling like success had always been his birthright. And me? I worked behind closed doors, in silence, turning chaos into profit. They called it helping the family. I called it survival. Because in our house, value wasn't about effort. It was about visibility. And I had none. But what they never realized was that invisibility can be a very powerful place to operate from. Because when no one is watching you, no one sees what you're really building. My father, Robert Hale, didn't just run the family, he controlled it. Every decision, every dollar, every narrative had to pass through him. He spoke like a visionary in public, but behind closed doors, he measured people by how useful they were to him. And I was his most efficient asset. "You're not emotional like other women," he once told me, almost like a compliment. "That's why you're valuable." Valuable. Not loved. Not respected. Just useful. My brother, Lucas, lived on the opposite side of that equation. He didn't understand the business, didn't need to. My father handed him praise, opportunities, and second chances like they were guaranteed by blood. I handled the consequences of his mistakes. Quietly. Repeatedly. And every time I fixed something he broke, my father would look at him and say, "That's how a man leads." Not once did he look at me. Not once did he say my name in those moments. And that silence? It was louder than any insult. Because it told me exactly where I stood. And exactly what they believed I would never become. The first time I realized how replaceable I wasn't during a crisis. It was during a meeting I had prepared for weeks. A major investor sat across the table, reviewing projections I had built from scratch for risk analyses, growth strategies, contingency plans. I knew every number without looking down. Halfway through, my father interrupted. "Lucas actually led this one," he said casually. I didn't react. Not externally. The investor turned to my brother, impressed. Asked him questions. Questions he couldn't answer. So I spoke, carefully, indirectly, feeding him the information without exposing him. And somehow, that made it worse. Because when the meeting ended, the investor shook his hand. "Brilliant work." My brother smiled like he believed it. My father nodded, proud. "And me?" I gathered the papers I created, and walked out without a word. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just a quiet, unsettling realization. If they could erase me that easily, what else were they willing to take? The worst part wasn't being ignored. It was being reduced, in front of everyone who mattered. It happened at my father's annual investor dinner, crystal glasses, tailored suits, quiet judgments hidden behind polite smiles. I had coordinated the entire event, down to the seating strategy and negotiation pairings. By the end of the night, the numbers were already shifting in our favor. And then my brother stood up to speak. He was slightly drunk. Confident in that careless way only someone protected can be. "I just want to thank my team," he said, raising his glass. "Even the ones who try their best." Laughter. Then he looked directly at me. "My sister here? She's still figuring things out. No husband, no kids, just spreadsheets." More laughter. I didn't move. Didn't defend myself. Because reacting would have given him control. So I stayed still and let them believe I was exactly what he said. But inside, something hardened. Because humiliation, when it's public, becomes a line you don't forget. And I had just crossed mine. The real loss didn't come with shouting. It came quietly, signed in ink. A week after that dinner, I found out my father had restructured the ownership of several key properties, assets I had spent years stabilizing. My name wasn't there. Not as a partner. Not as a stakeholder. Not even as a footnote. Everything had been reassigned to my brother. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "You were never meant to own anything," my father said, calm, almost bored. "You manage. That's your role." I remember standing there, documents in my hand, realizing something irreversible. 10 years of work, reduced to labor with no claim. No protection. No future. And the worst part? Legally, he was right. Or at least, that's what he wanted me to believe. So I nodded. Accepted it. Walked away without raising my voice. Because in that moment, I understood something critical. If they were willing to erase me on paper, then paper was exactly where I would have to fight back. And that's when I stopped being just useful. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I disappeared. Not physically, I was still there, answering calls, fixing problems, keeping everything running like I always had. But emotionally, I went quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable. I stopped correcting my brother in meetings. Stopped offering solutions before they were asked. Stopped saving him from himself. At night, the weight of it all settled in. 10 years of being needed, but never chosen. I would sit in the dark of my apartment, replaying every moment I had mistaken for respect. It wasn't respect. It was convenience. And once that truth settled, something inside me broke and rebuilt itself differently. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud. Reactive. Predictable. I couldn't afford that. So I let them believe I was defeated. That I had accepted my place. Because silence, when used correctly, isn't weakness. It's cover. And behind that silence, I started asking a different question. If I was never meant to own anything, then why did my grandmother warn me otherwise? It started with my grandmother. Before she passed, she held my hand longer than necessary. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were sharp. "They will take everything," she whispered. "Unless you understand what was really built." At the time, I thought she meant emotional strength. Family unity. Legacy. I was wrong. That night after the silence settled in my life, I reopened old folders, documents I had never fully questioned. Property records. Trust summaries. Legal structures my grandmother insisted I keep safe. I had always assumed my father controlled it all. But the deeper I looked, the more inconsistent things became. Dates that didn't align. Transfers that bypassed my father entirely. A structure layered too carefully to be accidental. And then it hit me. This wasn't his empire. It never fully was. My hand stopped moving over the keyboard. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to them. I was thinking ahead of them. And I made a decision that night. Not to expose anything, but to understand everything first. Because revenge without structure is just noise. And I was done making noise. From the outside, nothing changed. My father still walked into rooms like he owned them. My brother still spent money like it could never run out. And I stayed in the background, quiet, efficient, invisible. exactly how they wanted me. Then came the announcement. At a formal family meeting, my father revealed it with pride. Full control of the entire portfolio was now in my brother's hands. $18 million of assets, properties, and contracts. My son is finally ready, he said, as if I had never existed in the process. No one questioned it. No one looked at me. Not even when I was the one who had stabilized every crisis that made that number possible. I nodded politely. Congratulated him. Watched my brother smile like he had earned something he didn't understand. And inside me, there was no panic. No collapse. Only clarity. Because they didn't notice what they had just done. They hadn't defeated me. They had simply moved everything into the exact position I needed. After the announcement, I didn't celebrate. I observed. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. My brother didn't understand contracts, he signed whatever was placed in front of him. He didn't read clauses, didn't question guarantees. He only trusted confidence. My father's confidence. And that trust was a crack. So I began working differently. No more fixing visible problems. Instead, I traced invisible ones, ownership chains, loan guarantees, overlapping liabilities hidden inside family restructuring. At night, I cross-checked records against archived documents my grandmother had insisted I keep. That's when I found it. A legal structure buried beneath layers of trust agreements, older than my father's control. A system I had been inside all along, without knowing I was inside it. I leaned back from the screen, breathing slowly. They thought I was watching them fail. But I wasn't. I was learning exactly where they could fall. And for the first time, I understood the real shape of their weakness. I didn't act immediately. I never do. Instead, I confirmed everything twice, then a third time. Every document, every clause, every hidden dependency in the structure my grandmother left behind. It wasn't just ownership, it was control. Conditional control. Locked behind legal triggers no one in my family had ever bothered to read. So I started small. I requested archived copies of property amendments under the excuse of internal auditing. My father approved it without looking. My brother signed off on anything with a logo on it. That was the opening. I began quietly separating critical documents from active oversight systems, redirecting verification points, strengthening the original trust framework my grandmother had established. No confrontation. No alerts. Just invisible alignment. At the same time, I tracked my brother's financial behavior. The gambling patterns. The private loans. The offshore transfers he thought were untraceable. Everything was connected. And for the first time, I wasn't cleaning up his mess. I was mapping the collapse inside it. One wrong signature, and everything would shift. That's when things almost unraveled. An internal auditor, someone my father hired to verify the transition, requested full access to the same archives I had been quietly reviewing. If he looked too closely, he would see the inconsistencies. The layered trusts. The separation of authority. The fact that my brother's control wasn't as clean as everyone believed. For the first time, I felt pressure. Not panic. Pressure. So I adjusted. I didn't delete anything. That would be obvious. Instead, I restructured access paths just enough to redirect attention toward active, legitimate records, keeping the deeper layers legally insulated but invisible to surface review. At the same time, I had to move faster. My brother was getting reckless. Larger bets. Riskier deals. He started using property value as collateral without understanding the long-term exposure. Each move he made tightened the net around him. And I let him. Because now I wasn't trying to stop him. I was making sure every step he took brought him closer to the point where nothing could be undone. To keep everything stable, I had to give up something real. Access. I voluntarily stepped back from certain operational controls, systems I had built, workflows I had refined, even communication channels I used daily. On paper, it looked like I was being sidelined. In reality, I was removing myself from the blast radius. My father didn't question it. He assumed I was finally accepting my role. My brother didn't even notice. He was too busy borrowing more money against assets he didn't understand. But stepping back came at a cost. I lost visibility in real time. I could no longer intervene directly if something went wrong. I had to trust the structure I had quietly reinforced to hold. So I watched from a distance. Every signature my brother made. Every guarantee he signed without reading. Every loan tied back into the same fragile network. And I stayed silent. Because now, if I spoke too early, they would only fix the surface. But if I waited, the entire system would have to reveal itself. And I was willing to lose my position, if it meant they lost everything. Everything converged on the night of the will reading. The family gathered in the same polished room where I had been dismissed for years. My father sat at the head of the table like a king. My brother leaned back, already celebrating without knowing why. And I sat quietly. Calm. Prepared. When the lawyer began reading the documents, my father smiled, confident this was the moment his decision would be finalized in history. My son inherits all assets, he announced proudly, before the reading even finished. No one corrected him. Because no one had read what I had already placed into motion. Layer by layer, the truth was embedded in the legal structure, my grandmother's trust, the original ownership records, the hidden control clauses activated by mismanagement and unauthorized debt exposure. My brother had triggered everything without realizing it. And then I stood up. Not fast. Not emotional. Just certain. I think, I said softly, the lawyer should finish reading the full document. The room went still. For the first time, they were listening. The lawyer hesitated, then continued reading. Not the version my father expected, but the complete trust file my grandmother had built decades earlier. As of this activation, he read, voice tightening, all assets under the Hale estate are legally controlled by the designated trustee, Victoria Hale. My father froze. That's impossible, he snapped. I am the owner. I looked at him for the first time that night. You were never the owner, I said calmly. You were the administrator. The lawyer continued. He detailed the structure. My grandmother had placed everything into a protected trust 3 years before her death. My name was the sole controlling beneficiary. Every transfer my father made was only operational authority, never ownership. Then I placed the final folder on the table. Evidence of my brother's loans. Gambling debts. Illicit collateral agreements tied to family properties. The room erupted when the lawyer confirmed it. Multiple assets were illegally leveraged. My brother's face went pale. This is a mistake, he shouted. I didn't raise my voice. No, I said. It's documentation. Then I slid an eviction notice across the table, already signed under legal authority. For the first time, no one spoke back. The room didn't explode into chaos immediately. It collapsed into it. My brother was the first to break. He stood up too fast, knocking his chair back. This is fraud, he shouted, voice cracking. She's lying, she always wanted this. The lawyer didn't flinch. He simply placed a sealed medical affidavit on the table. Your grandmother was in a medically induced coma on the date of the alleged signature you submitted, he said. The document is invalid. And forensic analysis confirms the signature was forged. That was the moment everything shifted from denial to consequence. My brother went pale. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, but it was already too late. I had quietly submitted the financial irregularities days earlier, every illegal loan, every leveraged property, every hidden guarantee tied to assets he never truly owned. Outside the building, sirens arrived. Not one. Several. And then the doors opened. Authorities entered with precision, not emotion. My brother didn't resist at first, he couldn't process it. Only when he heard the word fraud did he finally panic. "I didn't know," he blurted, turning toward me. "You can fix this like you always do." That sentence used to define my entire life. But not anymore. I looked at him and answered clearly. "I stopped fixing your consequences when I realized you never stopped creating them." My father stood slowly, his authority gone in his posture alone. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the narrative, he was inside it. He turned to me, almost desperate now. "Save your brother," he said. "We can handle this privately." I shook my head. "No," I said. "You handle things privately for years. That's why we're here." The officers took my brother out as he screamed, protesting, blaming, begging. The sound faded down the hallway like something already decided. Then silence returned. My father stayed behind, broken in a way I had never seen. No speeches. No commands. Just the realization that the structure he believed was his had never belonged to him at all. I placed the final document on the table. Full legal transfer confirmation. My sole ownership. Clean. Final. Unchallengeable. "You built your empire assuming I was only useful," I said quietly. "You never asked what I was building while you weren't looking." He didn't answer. Because there was nothing left to argue. The creditors arrived within the hour. The remaining assets were frozen under legal enforcement tied to the fraudulent collateralization. Everything my brother had used as leverage was confiscated in order to settle the debts he created, exactly as the contracts dictated. By morning, the Whitmore estate, what was left of it, no longer functioned as a family empire. It was liquidation paperwork and empty rooms. My father lost access to all holdings. His influence dissolved with the same speed it had once been granted. No criminal charges were filed against him directly, but that didn't matter. His power had no structure left to exist inside. My brother was arrested for fraud, forgery, and financial misrepresentation tied to secured assets he never legally controlled. And me? I didn't celebrate. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath longer than necessary. I left the building alone while the sky was still gray, carrying nothing from that life except the proof of ownership that had always been mine. Not inherited that day. Just finally revealed. Weeks later, I sold off what I chose to keep, quietly, legally, without noise. I paid off every external liability tied to the estate, cleaned the structure, and walked away from the name entirely. No interviews. No statements. No revenge speeches. Only closure. Because I didn't need them to suffer for me to be free. I only needed them to no longer decide who I was. And for the first time in my life, they didn't. The empire they thought they gave away was never theirs to begin with. It was mine. They just didn't notice, until I stopped being invisible. If you were in my place, would you have waited as long as I did? If this story kept you watching until the end, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done in my place, and how far would you go after being underestimated like this?